Hello and welcome to part 2 of Mary Shelley. Now we've looked at Mary's childhood, we've looked at her meeting with the poet Shelley, her elopement with him, and eventual marriage to him after his wife committed suicide. We've seen her give birth to a daughter and, while still a teenager, writing and getting published her most famous book, Frankenstein. And now, having become disillusioned with England, Shelley decides to go off to Italy, taking with him his wife and daughter, and her half-sister, or step-sister rather, Claire Claremont, and her daughter by Lord Byron, and they all go off to Italy. In 1818, they were entranced by Italy and rented a villa by Lake Como while they waited for Byron to summon them. But all they got was a cold letter from him saying that all he wanted was Allegra, his little daughter, and he was sending a servant to collect her. Shelley decided that the mother didn't have the legal right to hold on to her if her father acknowledged paternity, and so the little girl was handed over. Claire was naturally devastated. They decided to move on to Livorno on the coast, where Mary Wollstonecraft and Godwin's friend Maria Reevely lived. Later, Mary saw this move as a turning point, opening the way for the series of disasters that now began. At first, though, all went well. Mary was delighted at meeting the woman who'd known her mother and had first nursed her. Maria shared the same political beliefs as the Shelleys. If only my father had married her, Mary thought. But she didn't enjoy Livorno. It was a stupid place, she said. So they moved again to Bagna di Lucca, up in the hills. The Villa Bertini was a magical place, and both of them enjoyed the scenery there, although Mary refused to follow her husband's habit of wandering about the countryside naked. Then things started to go wrong. There was an urgent summons from the nursemaid who'd accompanied Allegra to Venice. What had happened? Shelley set out for Venice with Claire, leaving Mary on her own to look after the children. But Clara, her daughter, showed signs of sickness. Then a letter came, summoning Mary too. She left for Venice with the children, although it was clear now that Clara was very ill. It was her 21st birthday. She arrived at the house outside Venice Byron had lent them after a 4-day journey. The child was now dehydrating, probably as a result of dysentery. Shelley went into the city to find a doctor, but it was too late. Clara had stopped breathing, although her mother still clung to her and wouldn't let go. Eventually she let Shelley take her and bury her on the Venetian Lido. She was bitter and distraught and blamed everyone, because it turned out their journey had been completely unnecessary. The nursemaid had exaggerated. There was nothing wrong with Allegra. Grief-stricken, the Shelleys set out on their travels, first to Naples and then to Rome, where they took a house by the Spanish Steps near what is now the Keats Shelley Museum. Eventually they came together again. The bond between them was too strong, and soon Mary was pregnant again. Perhaps things were looking up. They weren't. Her other child, little Will Mouse, as they called William, was now a charming 3-year-old, fluent English and Italian. The proud parents had his portrait painted. Then he fell sick. The doctor diagnosed a worm infection. He didn't improve. To Mary's horror, he began to suffer from the same convulsions that had killed Clara. He couldn't die too. The hopes of my life are bound up in him, she wrote. But he did die. On June the 7th, 1819, almost certainly of malaria, and was buried in the Protestant cemetery. Both parents were devastated. Shelley wept. Mary went over obsessively everything that had gone wrong. If only they hadn't come to Italy. The world would never be again the same as it was, she wrote to Leigh Hunt. She'd failed as a mother, was a living curse to her children. She turned in on herself and retreated into silence. No one could help her out of this depressed mood, which seemed almost suicidal, although everyone tried. Not Claire, Not her father in his letters, not Shelley himself, although he tried his best by moving them out of Rome and back to the coast. And she was soon to give birth. It was a writing that eventually pulled her through. While Shelley was writing Prometheus Unbound, which in a way is his answer to Frankenstein, the subtitle of which is The New Prometheus, Mary now sketched out a story of a girl called Matilda, who is loved rather too much by her father. This theme of incest was a common one at the time, used by Shelley himself and by Byron, who of course had an incestuous relationship himself with his half-sister Augusta. Mary related the theme to herself and a complicated relationship with her own father. Shelley decided that Florence would be the best place for the new baby to be born, and so they moved again, into a modest rooming house, with Amelia remarkably similar to that described by E.M. Forster in A Room with a View 100 years later. The other guests were, of course, intensely suspicious of the notorious Democrat and atheist Shelley, and the two dubious women with him. Shelley made no secret of his views, and they became, if anything, more extreme when news reached Italy of the Peterloo massacre in Manchester. The deaths of innocent people made Mary despair once more, but Shelley was energised. He wrote his angriest and most revolutionary poem, The Mask of Anarchy, and walking along the banks of the Arno into the teeth of a gale, composed the famous Ode to the West Wind, with its hopeful line, "If winter comes, can spring be far behind?" He was determined to keep positive, even if his wife wasn't. With her time approaching, Mary finished Matilda and sent it off to her father to get it published. He read it, found the story disgusting, and refused to have anything to do with it. The novel wasn't published until 1959. On the 12th of November, after a labour of only 2 hours, she gave birth to a healthy boy. They called him Percy Florence, after his father and the city where he'd been born. Only a few months later, another baby was to be born and named after the city, but this time a girl, Florence Nightingale. Mary was elated, and yet couldn't shake off a sickening feeling of dread. She'd been here before, and look how it had turned out. She never entirely shook off this feeling for the rest of her life. It made her touchy and irritable, particularly with her husband. Claire warned her not to drive Shelley away. A bad wife is like a winter in a house. And in the unusually cold Italian weather, he did have a mild flirtation with a young cousin who'd come out to meet him. They moved again, this time to Pisa, where none other than Margaret King, Mary Wollstonecraft's old charge when she was a governess in Ireland, was living. Margaret had been forced by her parents, the Kingsboroughs, into a loveless marriage, had borne 8 children, and then eloped with a penniless young man. She'd become one of the first female doctors, graduating in Germany, dressed as a man. Mary Wollstonecraft would have undoubtedly been proud of how she'd turned out. Margaret found a new home for Claire, and left on their own, the relationship between the Shelleys improved and life became more tranquil. Mary now sat down to write another novel. Set in Renaissance Italy and based partly on real characters, it was called Valperga. The story is very dark. The central character is a follower of Machiavelli and kills everyone who gets in his way. Mary was just as much an opponent of tyranny and injustice as her husband. In 1820, both husband and wife had mild flirtations. Mary was attracted to Prince Mavrocordato, a handsome Greek who had come to Italy to recruit men who would fight for Greek independence from the Turks, a cause which attracted Shelley as it did Byron. Mavrocordato flattered Mary, who began to take more care about her appearance. He promised to teach her modern Greek, but the outbreak of rebellion in Greece called him back, and that was as far as it went. Meanwhile, Shelley had been introduced to the beautiful daughter of the governor of Pisa, Teresa Viviani. Teresa begged him to take pity on her, as her father had put her in a convent for refusing to marry the man he wanted. It was a remarkably lax convent because she could come and go as she pleased. But Shelley was moved, and so was Mary. To Mary, her story seemed similar to her own, and she gave her 2 caged birds to keep her company. But in Shelley's case, things went further. He cherished romantic fantasies about her. He wrote her poetry. She made him feel alive again, he said. The affair, if it could be so-called was never consummated, but it seems Teresa wanted that. She began sending Mary barbed little notes designed to drive a wedge between her and Shelley. But involved as she was with the prince, Mary could do little about it. In the end, Teresa's parents put a stop to Shelley's visits, and the affair fizzled out. In any case, Shelley's attention was diverted by Keats's death in January 1821. He wrongly believed that the death had been caused not by TB, but by the bad reviews he'd received, something Shelley himself had always suffered from, and it inspired him to write his last great poem, Adonais, as an elegy for him. Mary and he now made new friends. Edward and Jane Williams had come to Pisa for the birth of their illegitimate child, because they were both actually married to other people and had eloped with each other. Mary was thrilled by a girl behaving in the same romantic way she had, and Shelley, as always, was a believer in free love. He was also impressed by Edward's love of the sea. Thinking quite wrongly that Edward was an experienced sailor, they went out sailing together. The first time they tried it, Edward capsized the boat. It was an ominous warning, which Shelley ignored. Then Byron turned up in Pisa. He'd got tired of Venice, or possibly the Venetians had grown tired of him. Having acquired an Italian mistress, he dumped little Allegra in a convent. In Pisa, he indulged in his usual appalling behaviour, and Shelley did his best to match him. They competed with each other. Who was the best rider? Who was the best shot? The Pisans were soon up in arms. Word of the goings-on reached the press in England, and all the old slurs were revived. Byron was sleeping with Mary. Shelley was preaching anarchy. Williams was joined by his friend, the dashing Edward Trelawney, and the group made a tight little circle. Mary was dazzled by Trelawney, who took her to parties and accompanied her to the carnival, where she dressed in the Turkish costume. It seems possible there was a romance between them. Once again, the relevant entries in her diary are missing. If there was one, it soon fizzled out. Mary found she was pregnant again, and besides her intuition told her there was something untrustworthy about Trelawney, and her intuition proved right. Trelawney, like the other men, was now obsessed with sailing. Byron was having a boat built called the Bolivar, named after the South American Revolutionary. The plan was to have it built in Genoa and then sail it across the Gulf to La Spezia, where the group planned to spend a summer holiday. Shelley determined to match him and have his own boat built. A house was now taken in a remote village, the Casa Magni. Mary hated it the moment she saw it. She had another intuition of impending doom. Nonetheless, they moved in, Mary and Shelley sleeping in separate rooms. They were joined by Claire and the Williamses. The news now came that Allegra had died of typhus. Claire was consumed in grief. It seemed as though she might die of it, or in fact, she outlived all the rest of them. Mary wondered whether Allegra's death was the doom that she'd imagined, or whether there was another death to come. She feared for little Percy, and urged Shelley to allow them to return to Pisa, an idea he turned down. The estrangement between them grew greater. He was in a strange mood that summer. He feared again for his health and began to see hallucinations of a spectral child. Mary was left alone to run the household and deal with the servants and pay the bills. The boat Shelley had built to rival Byron's had at last arrived. Shelley named it Ariel, a nickname that he gave to Jane Williams, which this didn't improve Mary's mood. And in the sultry weather, everyone quarrelled with everyone else. Trelawney now arrived in the Bolivar, which to Shelley's annoyance was a much bigger boat than his. He and Williams worked on the Ariel to lengthen the masts and increase the sail, thus making it top-heavy. Then Mary had a miscarriage. The bleeding was so heavy that her life was despaired of. Shelley now showed his true colours. He plunged her into a bath full of water and ice, and this drastic treatment saved her life. It might have brought them together, but it didn't. Shelley's behaviour grew more peculiar. He had nightmares and was haunted by demons. He began to remind Mary of Frankenstein himself. News came that Byron was nearby in Livorno. Shelley decided to show off the Ariel and sail across the bay to greet him. Mary urged him not to, but he took no notice. He promised he would be back in a week, and he and Williams set sail on the 1st of July, 1822. The week came and went, and there was no sign of the boat. She became desperately worried. Still not recovered from miscarriage, she and Jane set out to find them. She saw Byron, who assured her that the Ariel had set out on time for home. So where was it then? Trelawney told her that he would look for news, and they should return home. When she came in sight of the sea, she had a premonition that it was her husband's grave. On the 19th of July, Trelawney turned up at Casa Magni, his face so deathly pale he frightened the maid. Jane fainted, but Mary heard him out as he told the grim story. 3 corpses had been washed up on the beach near Viareggio. The bodies were partly eaten away and decomposed. Williams was identified by his boot, Shelley by the volume of Keats's poetry he had in his pocket. The 3rd body was of a young boy they'd hired as a hand. They'd set out for home, as they'd promised, in fine weather. Then a sudden squall had blown up. All the ships in the vicinity headed for shore, but the Ariel, 10 miles out, continued its course. What exactly happened isn't known. A romantic legend soon grew up that Shelley, disillusioned with life, had willed his own death, had turned down opportunities to escape. It seems likely that the unseaworthy vessel was simply overwhelmed by the mountainous waves. "It's all over," Mary had said, even before Shelley's death was confirmed. She was to live for another 29 years, but in a sense it was true. The rest of her life was an anticlimax devoted to creating a myth around her husband, which bore increasingly little resemblance to reality. The myth-making began at once. What was to be done with the bodies? Mary wanted Shelley to be buried next to their son in Rome, but the Italian authorities objected. They insisted on cremation. Trelawney decided on the most dramatic cremation possible, a Hindu-type funeral pyre, such as he'd seen in India. After much wrangling, he got permission to dig up the bodies from the beach and burn them, first Williams and then Shelley. As Shelley's body burned, his shrivelled heart was laid open, and Trelawney snatched it as a gruesome memento. Mary wasn't present, but she knew all the details and recorded them in a letter to her friend, Maria Gisborne. Eventually the heart was given to her to keep. Trelawney took Shelley's ashes to Rome and buried them, leaving space, as he told her, for her if she wanted to join him. Mary wasn't ready for that, but nonetheless, the love of her life was gone, and she was still only 25, with a young son to bring up. How would she live her life? Hunt and other friends were amazed and disturbed by her unemotional responses. Once again she turned in on herself, burying her grief deep and in a sense never recovering from it. Her first instinct was that the unpublished and unfinished works of Shelley must be published. This included The Liberal, the magazine he planned to produce, liberalism then indicating advanced revolutionary democracy. The first issue was actually published, with help from Byron and from Hunt, who acted as editor. Without them, Mary and Claire would have been left penniless. Claire now went off to Austria to be a governess. Mary was determined not to leave Italy and moved to Genoa, but her reputation preceded her and everyone there cold-shouldered her. Her father urged her to return to England, and Byron suggested writing to Shelley's father and asking for money. After all, little Percy was now heir to his estate. She was reluctant, so he wrote on her behalf. It was all in vain. Sir Timothy told him he had no intention of helping that woman who had estranged his son from his family duty. Of course he would look after Percy, but only if Mary surrendered custody of him. That she would never do. I couldn't live 10 days without him, she said. She would have to return to England, using the last of her money to get there. She was greeted by her father and by placards denouncing the Lyceum Theatre for daring to put on an improper play called The Fate of Frankenstein. She knew nothing about this, and had no control over the numerous versions of the story that now appeared, and began to twist its meaning. By the 1840s, the term Frankenstein's monster was already common, and her highly moral tale was being transformed into a mere horror story. Mary was now back almost to square one, living in her father's house again, although this time her stepmother left her alone. Sir Timothy Shelley eventually agreed to give her a miserly allowance, but only on condition she stopped publishing any of his son's works. If she refused, he would seize young Percy. But she couldn't bring herself to allow Shelley's poems to go unknown and unread. She decided to bring out an edition anonymously. She enjoyed the process of editing, and since they'd been such close collaborators, knew how his mind worked and what he would have wanted. This was all right with poems that she knew, but she discovered poems she didn't know. Poems written in more recent years in praise of Teresa or Jane Williams. These gave her pain, but she would publish them nonetheless. Great literature was great literature. Some of the poems were mere fragments, which she pieced together. And it's not known in some cases which was Shelley's original work and which actually were Mary's. Posthumous poems came out in 1824. Sir Timothy was furious and managed to stop sales, but not before many people had bought it and passed it on to their friends. Shelley's reputation began to soar, but it was a different Shelley from the real man. In her preface, Mary, anxious to prevent any scandal, portrayed her husband as an ethereal spirit, too good for this world. He was a gentle artist, completely uninterested in politics, certainly not a believer in free love or atheism, and this was the version which began to spread. Meanwhile, Mary was writing another book of her own, the most interesting of her later novels because, like Frankenstein, it's another essay in which would much later be called science fiction. The Last Man is set in the 21st century and is the story of a mysterious plague, a pandemic, which wipes out the whole of humanity, except for one survivor, who laments, "I am a tree rent by lightning. I am alone in the world." Mary's feelings exactly. To ease her melancholy, she moved into a country cottage with Jane Williams. The exact relationship between the two is not known, although Jane, despite carrying on an affair with Thomas Hogg, also declared her love for Mary, and some of their letters are flirtatious to say the least. Jane comforted her when The Last Man was published and got the usual scathing reviews. But their relationship, if there was one, came to a dead end when Mary discovered Jane was pregnant by Hogg and found out she'd been spreading malicious stories that Shelley preferred her to Mary and had been so unhappy in his marriage that he'd wanted to die. Mary now moved out and into lodgings in London, which he shared with Claire, who had, like a bad penny, turned up again. Mary had to spend all her time writing in order to pay the rent and pay Percy's school fees, while Claire contributed nothing. Most of her writing now was for ladies' annuals, and she had to drastically tone down her beliefs in print so as not to offend the readership. But underneath, she was as radical as ever. Things went on in this vein until 1832, when at the age of 34, and 10 years after Shelley's death, she finally met a man who interested her. He was handsome and intelligent and aristocratic, and his name was Aubrey Beauclerk. He'd had numerous affairs before and fathered 2 illegitimate children, but that didn't bother Mary. He had the same political beliefs as she did, and she was strongly attracted to him, as he was to her, finding her reserved and dignified rather than the wild creature he'd been expecting. Mary did have a sense of fun, but reserved it usually for children. They went for walks and to the theatre, and after a few months were enjoying what she described as ineffable bliss. After the passing of the Reform Bill, he got himself elected an MP, and as a rising politician, he needed a wife. Mary certainly contemplated the idea of marriage. She was intrigued by the idea of a man who was a more respectable version of Shelley, a reformer who worked within the system. She introduced him to her father, who approved. All seemed to be going well, but when she went down with influenza, he didn't come to visit or even write to her. She discovered that he'd proposed to another woman, a 19-year-old heiress. She was devastated at such betrayal, but picked herself up again for the sake of her son. Percy Florence was turning out to be somewhat of a disappointment. He was pudgy, short, and had a stoop. He was nothing like either his father or his mother, but took after his grandfather, more interested in hunting than poetry. Nonetheless, he was devoted to her, and she moved out to the country so she could afford to send him to Harrow. She now expressed her disillusionment with men in another novel, Lodore. In this, all the male characters are weak, and the central character is an intellectual woman who makes her own way in the world, obviously inspired by their mother. It sold better than her previous books, and she quickly wrote another based on English history, Perkin Warbeck. She decided it was time to revise her first novel. This created the Frankenstein we know now. Many of the improvements made by Shelley were removed, and the criticisms of male-dominated society became more bitter. Republished, it still didn't sell well, perhaps because its negative attitude towards science and progress wasn't what people in the 19th century wanted to hear. To make ends meet, she still had to work at hack work. A friend of her father's, Dionysius Lardner, was launching a new popular encyclopedia and invited Mary to write the biographical essays on literary figures. She wrote 50 of these essays, over 1,000 pages all told, and because they were mostly anonymous, she was able to express her own ideas without having to stick to a plot as in fiction. Her personal life continued to be one of disappointments. Percy Florence was so useless at school, she had to withdraw him. Then her father, now 80, took sick, and with Mary at his bedside, he died in April 1836. Despite their sometimes turbulent relationship, she suffered immense pain. The funeral was a macabre affair, since he insisted on being buried alongside his first wife, and so Mary Wollstonecraft's grave had to be opened and her coffin shifted to make room for his. As his literary executor, Mary felt it her duty to write his biography, but he left his papers in a terrible mess, and Mary was worried about how much she should reveal. Her father's warts and all memoir of her mother had disastrously damaged her reputation. If she told the full story of William Godwin's life, she would have to mention how revolutionary his ideas had once been, the full story of his relationship with her mother, not to mention Fanny's suicide and her own elopement. After 4 years of struggling, she decided to give up the project. Godwin had also wanted her to publish his final book, An Attack on Christianity. She decided that in early Victorian England this was not a good idea. Instead, she published her own book, Faulkner. This was another novel with a woman as central character, persuading the men in her life to curb their ambitions and accept the feminine virtue of peace. Its implication was that if only women ruled the world, there'd be no more war. Again, a view that most critics found uncongenial. This was to be her last novel. It was taking too much out of her to be met with these constant rejections. Mary was now approached by Tennyson's publisher, who wanted to publish a 4-volume edition of Shelley's work. Thanks partly to her, the man who'd been practically an outcast was now the hero of a younger generation. Sir Timothy had at last softened, and as well as paying for Percy to go through Cambridge, agreed at last to allow his son's poetry to be properly published. He insisted, though, that there be no biography written, but Mary got round this by adding extensive notes to each poem, giving such details of his life as she thought appropriate. But as she read through all the old letters and diaries, she realised that most of it couldn't be revealed, at least until attitudes changed. "This is not the time to reveal the truth," she wrote. When the poems were published in 1840, they were an immediate success. But some of Shelley's friends, led by Trelawney, who now blamed her for his death, complained that she'd censored him. So she brought out a revised edition, which included more of his political and atheistic writings, and this produced the predictable conservative backlash, with the publisher being sued for blasphemy. At this point, Aubrey suddenly re-entered her life. His young wife had died and he came back to her side. She expected another proposal, but it was not to be. History exactly repeated itself. Once again, he proposed to and married a much younger woman. This confirmed her view of men. "Unhappy, betrayed, alone," she wrote in her diary. But she was now in her 40s and comfortably off. Percy now had a generous allowance from his grandfather and shared it with her. They could move to Mayfair. She now had a circle of literary friends like Disraeli and the Carlyles, although their interest in her, of course, was that she was the widow of the great Shelley. She could now afford to travel abroad again. She went to Paris, where French poets like Lamartine came to visit her, anxious to meet her because she was the widow of Shelley. She went on to Italy, but it held too many sad memories for her. She tried but failed to find the graves of little Clara and William. but her husband's grave was clearly marked by cypresses planted by Trelawney. She began to suffer violent headaches, which she attributed to her remembered sorrows, but were more probably early signs of the brain disease which was to kill her. She returned to England to write Rambles in Germany and Italy, her last book, consciously modelled on her mother's letters. True to her political beliefs, she strongly condemned the Austrian occupation of Italy, and since this was a popular stance in England, it was the only thing most reviewers noticed about it. In 1844, Sir Timothy finally died. Percy inherited the estate in Sussex and the title, and he also inherited the debts. Mary took charge, and by cutting costs and selling land, succeeded in retrieving the situation. Since the house, Field Place, was unlivable in, they took a country cottage in Putney and a townhouse in what is now Belgravia. But she wasn't happy. Her headaches grew worse. The doctors were at a loss and diagnosed, as they usually did with women, a nervous complaint. She went to Baden-Baden to take the waters and Brighton for the sea air, but nothing worked. Unable to work, her main task now was to find Percy a suitable wife, and in 1848 she found one. Jane St. John was a widow, not pretty, but sensible, and would keep Percy on the straight and narrow. Jane came to revere her new mother-in-law. Field Place had now been renovated, and the newly married couple moved in, taking Mary with them. She insisted on having the bedroom that Shelley had once slept in. The trouble was that Field Place was low-lying, a swamp as she described it, and her health went rapidly downhill. Jane acted as her nurse. Claire, still going strong, came to visit her, but they soon quarrelled again. Jane and Percy tried everything to revive Mary, including a trip to the south of France, but nothing worked. They took her to London to be near the best doctors. The great Dr. Bright, discoverer of the disease named after him, was called in, and he told them the truth. She had a brain tumour. Percy and Jane took turns to keep vigil by her bedside. By January 1851, her left leg was paralysed. She then suffered violent convulsions and lapsed into a coma, never to awake. She died on the 1st of February, still only 53. Percy was inconsolable. He'd never been parted from his mother for more than a few months. Jane took charge of the funeral arrangements. Mary had told her she wanted to be buried, not next to her mother and father, in St. Pancras. Jane was horrified. For one thing, he was notorious for grave robbers. She and Percy had taken a house in the new, up-and-coming resort of Bournemouth. She decided to bury her there, in St. Peter's graveyard, and have the bodies of Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin dug up and buried there too. The vicar objected. He didn't want such notorious radicals buried in his churchyard. But Jane ignored him and went ahead anyway. And there, in this incongruous setting, the three of them lie. Shelley's heart was later buried in Christchurch Priory, and there's also a monument to Mary Shelley there. Mary Wollstonecraft's epitaph credits her with writing The Vindication, but there's no mention of Frankenstein on her daughter's epitaph. There's no mention either of Mary Jane Godwin, for the very good reason that she'd been left behind in St. Pancras. Claire, as her daughter, was furious about this, but she was ignored. At their home, Boscombe Manor, Percy and Jane created a shrine to the two Marys, including many of their possessions. Promptly burnt anything she considered offensive. She wrote a book called Shelley Memorials, which completely rewrote history. In this version, Shelley and Mary had never eloped and only confessed their love after Harriet was dead. Mary was entirely selfless and virtuous, an ideal of Victorian womanhood. In a sense, Mary had only herself to blame for this treatment. She turned Shelley, the wild man, selfish in his attitude to women, often vain and stupid as he showed in the manner of his death, into an otherworldly, saintly, Christian-hearted gentleman, a sort of Victorian martyr. Byron, of course, got the same treatment, not mad, bad and dangerous, but a hero who died for the cause of freedom. Of course, Mary was not the only 19th century lady, long widowed, who turned her dead husband into a sort of marble statue. Queen Victoria did exactly the same thing with Prince Albert. But the Queen could never be taken out of the picture. Mary could be, and was. She painted herself out almost entirely, an ironic outcome for the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft. Although the story of Frankenstein went from strength to strength, its author was almost forgotten. It was well into the 20th century before she began to be remembered. In the 1931 Hollywood version of Frankenstein, she appears as a character, played by Elsa Lanchester, later on the bride of Frankenstein, of course. In a scene at the beginning where she reads her story, which is, as we've seen, she never did, to a highly unlikely Byron and Shelley. But it was in the 1960s, with the rise of feminism, that her reputation really began to take off, parallel with that of her mother, so that now she rather outshines her husband. But whilst her mother now has her monument, however controversial, her daughter still awaits hers. Let's hope that when it comes, it's less controversial. Thank you very much. That's the end.